They say history is written in ink, but in the valleys of Erthos, history was always written in blood and ash. The whispers that coil around the crumbling ramparts of Castle Druss speak not of valor, but of a silence so profound it still swallows the light. This is not the tale of a golden age, nor of a righteous king, but of the moment the heavens turned their back on men, and a boy named Kael learned that a crown is just a circle of metal that holds sorrow in place. Thanks for listening to Boring for Sleep. If this story helped you drift away, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Our story begins not with a sunrise, but with an endless twilight, 50 years after the Great Cleansing. The year is 1147. The air still tastes of iron and regret. Kael was 10 years old the night the fire finally found them. For years, his mother, Elara, had kept them hidden in the forgotten chapel of St. Vivian, tucked like a bruised pearl beneath the roots of the whisperwood. She taught him scripture, but mostly she taught him silence. She taught him that the sound of a distant hoofbeat was a prophecy of pain, and that the only thing a true heir to the shattered throne of Erthos owned was his invisibility. But silence, Kael was soon to learn, is merely the pause before the shout. On that night, a moonless blanket had been pulled across the sky. The chapel was small, carved from ancient, black stone, smelling perpetually of damp earth and stale incense. Kael slept curled beside the cold marble altar, dreaming of a father he had never met, King Gareth, the Ash King, they called him now, because everything he touched eventually turned to dust. A sound, not a hoofbeat, but a muffled, grinding thud, the unmistakable weight of a man falling onto packed snow, snapped the boy awake. His mother's hand was already clamped over his mouth, not out of cruelty, but out of a fierce, protective necessity that had become their language. "Hush! My breath, Kael. Breathe mine, not your own," she mouthed, her eyes wide, reflecting the tiny, frantic flame of their tallow candle. The wooden door shuddered. Not from a blow, but from a calculated, terrible pressure. The door had no lock. It was sealed by a single, simple crossbar that was now proving tragically insufficient against the force gathering outside. Elara moved with the grace of a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark mirror of her dread. She knelt, fumbling beneath the altar cloth, pulling free a small, lead-weighted box. Inside lay not jewels, but a single, brittle scroll tied with a frayed gold thread, the decree of the First Lords, the ancient document that proved Kael's lineage, and therefore, his death warrant. "You must go, Kael." "No," she whispered, her voice a razor's edge against his ear. "The escape hatch. Behind the baptismal font. You know it." The boy gripped the scroll, his knuckles white against the velvet lining of the box. His world, usually so small and manageable, suddenly felt immense and terrifying. "Man, I won't leave you. We swore to stay together." She forced a smile, a mask so beautiful it almost broke his heart. "And we are, my light. Forever. But a queen cannot run from those who come to claim her silence. A future king, however, must run until his heart breaks and then run some more." The bar outside splintered with a terrifying crack. Elara pushed him hard towards the font. The heavy marble basin concealed a rough-hewn trap-door leading to an old drainage tunnel. Kael scrambled towards it, the cold stone pressing against his cheek. Behind him, the door burst inward, tearing off its hinges. The chapel was suddenly flooded with the stench of oil, wet leather, and cold-blooded intent. 3 armored figures stood silhouetted against the night snow, mercenaries of the usurper Lord Valerius, their faces hidden by grim helms, their swords drawn and catching the meager candlelight. Elara did not turn to face them. She stood defiantly before the altar, her small frame shielding the place Kael was trying desperately to open. She looked up at the crumbling crucifix above the altar, and in that moment, Kael saw not his mother, but the daughter of a king. "You are too late," she announced, her voice trembling, but loud enough to fill the chapel. "The line lives. The truth endures." A grim laugh echoed off the stone walls, hollow and cruel. The central mercenary, taller, broader, his breastplate scored with 100 battles, stepped forward, his boot crunching on the fallen wood. "Truth, Queen Elara? Truth is whatever the sword dictates. And today, the sword says the line ends here." The steel rose. Kael, his 10-year-old body shaking with a primal, suffocating fear, finally wrenched the heavy lid of the hatch open. He slipped inside the cold, dark tunnel just as the first terrible sound of the blade meeting flesh tore through the silence of the chapel. It was a sound that did not belong to the world of men. It was the sound of everything beautiful and safe being ripped away. He heard his mother's single, sharp cry, a sound that would echo in his skull for the next 20 years, a sound that drove his every choice, his every victory, his every inevitable fall. Kael scrambled blindly into the sewer-cold darkness, the decree clutched to his chest. He was no longer a child. He was an oath, a scar, and the last, desperate breath of a forgotten kingdom, running from a history written in blood and ash. And in that dark tunnel, 10-year-old Kael, the hidden prince, swore his first and final vow: the usurper would fall, and the silence of Erthos would finally be broken by the thunder of a returned king. His encounter with Brother Thomas, his future mentor. The drainage tunnel smelled of rot, but to Kael, it smelled of survival. He crawled until his elbows bled and his lungs burned, the weight of the decree of the First Lord's a terrible, cold stone pressing against his chest. He did not cry. Grief was a luxury reserved for those who had a roof over their heads and a name they could speak aloud. He had neither. When he finally clawed his way out into the choking black of the city's underbelly, the moon was rising over the smoke-choked sprawl of Valerius's capital. He learned the rules quickly. Rule 1: never look up. The towers were for the wealthy, the guards, and the usurper's spies. Rule 2: never stay still. Stillness invited notice, and notice invited ruin. Rule 3: the most important of all: forget the boy who knew silence. That boy was dead. In his place was Crow. Crow was not Kael. Crow was a blur of ragged woolen cloth and quick, hungry shadows. He was a creature of the alleys and the fish markets, surviving on stolen bread crusts and the momentary warmth of a flickering refuse fire. His hands, once soft, became quick and knowing, able to slip a coin from a full purse or crack open a rusted locket with equal, ruthless efficiency. The city itself was a monstrous contradiction. Above the streets, the marble churches and guild halls stood as monuments to a prosperity that had died with the Ash King. But down in the belly of the dragon, the sprawling slum near the docks, the streets were rivers of mud and sewage, and every shadow held a threat. Valerius's reign had created a chasm, opulence for the few who pledged fealty, and crushing misery for everyone else. The common folk were slowly being hollowed out, their hope replaced by a dull, persistent resentment. Kael, the prince, saw their faces. The woman shivering by the bridge, her baby thin and silent. The old man weeping over a broken loom. He saw the cold, casual brutality of the Silver Guard, Valerius's elite soldiers, who wore their cruelty like a badge of honor, beating and mocking the starving with equal relish. Each sight was a new scar on his young heart, a fresh layer of iron coating the vow he had made in the dark tunnel. This suffering was his inheritance. His most precious possession, the decree, he hid inside the wall of a ruined crypt, sealed with mortar he stole from a construction site. It was too dangerous to carry. It was his anchor, buried deep, a piece of truth waiting for the day he was strong enough to unearth it. The scholar in the grime. The years whispered by, a long, brutal string of cold nights and empty stomachs. Kael turned 14, tall and gaunt, his eyes holding the weary knowledge of a man twice his age. He had learned the language of survival, the subtle tilt of a merchant's head when his attention wandered, the rhythm of the night watch's boot steps, the exact sound of cheap ale spilling onto cobblestones. One bitter afternoon, he tried to steal a loaf from a bakery cart. He misjudged the baker, a thick-set brute with a temper as hot as his ovens. The baker caught him, his grip like iron on Kael's wrist, and was dragging the boy towards the market square, where summary justice was often brutal and swift. "Thief! Filth! You'll lose that hand, boy!" the baker roared, attracting the cruel, idle attention of the passers-by. Kael struggled fiercely, his fear sharp and metallic. Just as the baker raised his free hand, a quiet, insistent voice cut through the noise. "A single loaf of dry bread, Master Elms. Is that worth the ruination of a young soul?" Kael looked up. Standing there was a man unlike any Kael had seen in the belly, Brother Thomas. He was slight, dressed in the simple, frayed robes of a forgotten monastic order, his face kind but stern, his eyes the color of old slate, deeply knowing. He carried a stack of worn books tucked under his arm. "Stay out of this, Thomas," the baker grunted, not letting go. "He's vermin. Vermin will not to survive, Master Elms. It is the failure of the harvest, not the failure of the boy's heart, that brings us to this ugliness. Name your price for the bread, and his freedom." Thomas offered a small, silver coin, a significant sum for a simple loaf. The baker, greedy, snatched the coin and flung Kael away with a disgusted shove. Kael scrambled back, ready to run, but Thomas was looking directly at him. Not with pity, which Kael despised, but with a quiet, searching interest that unnerved him far more. "You have quick hands, young man," Thomas observed softly, adjusting his spectacles. but they are wasted on petty theft. They keep me alive. Kael spat, rubbing his bruised wrist. Life is more than just survival, Crow. It is purpose. And I see a desperate purpose coiled within you. Thomas tilted his head. Do you know what that scroll you guard so fiercely is truly worth? Kael froze. How could he know about the decree? He felt a sudden, cold wave of terror that transcended even the fear of the Silver Guard. I don't know what you're talking about, old man, Kael hissed, backing away. Thomas merely smiled, a sad, knowing curve of the lips. The scent of that chapel clings to you, boy. The scent of fear, and the scent of kingship. I served your father, Kael. I was his historian and his confessor. And I have been waiting. The hidden classroom. That night marked the end of the Crow and the slow, agonizing return of Kael, the prince. Thomas took him not to a palace, but to a hidden chamber beneath the ruined monastery library, a place that smelled, miraculously, of parchment and pine needles instead of rot. Here, Thomas began the long, arduous task of unteaching the boy years of survival instinct and replacing it with the brutal weight of duty. Kael learned that a king must be not just strong, but wise. He learned that justice was a finer weapon than a knife, and that history was a battlefield as important as any physical one. The usurper wins because he has rewritten the past, Thomas taught, tracing lines on a massive, faded map of Erthos. He portrays your father as a fool, a weakling who brought the famine and the wars. You must learn the truth, Kael, so you can speak it with the authority of the throne. He taught Kael to read the ancient script of the decree. He revealed the truth of the Ash King, Gareth, that he was not a failure, but a deeply moral man whose reforms were crushed by the entrenched greed of the noble houses Valerius now commanded. Gareth's failure was his mercy. Your father refused to bathe the kingdom in blood to secure his crown. Valerius had no such reservations, Thomas said, his voice grim. Kael devoured the knowledge. He learned military tactics from old banned treaties. He learned the names and sigils of the noble houses who remained secretly loyal. But most importantly, he learned to control the raw, burning hatred that was the only emotion he allowed himself since his mother's death. Hate is fire, Kael, Thomas warned him, tapping the boy's chest. It can forge steel, but if you do not master it, it will burn away the very kingdom you seek to save. Your father was consumed by grief. You must be fueled by justice. The training was relentless. Thomas, frail as he seemed, was utterly unyielding. He challenged Kael's intellect, his morals, and his physical endurance. And in that hidden library, for the first time in years, Kael found a fragile sense of peace. He had a purpose, a guide, and a hidden truth. But the shadows of the city still called to him. He was a prince, yes, but he was still Crow, a thief who needed to breathe the night air and test his sharp edges. It was during one such reckless foray, scavenging for supplies Thomas desperately needed, that he found her. Sitting alone on the stoop of a crumbling tavern, her chin resting on her knees, her eyes holding the same old, bitter knowledge Kael saw in his own reflection. Her name was Elara. And her cynicism, Kael would soon find, was the only thing sharp enough to pierce the armor he was so diligently building around his heart. Elara. She was a different kind of shadow than Kael was used to, not the cold, predatory darkness of the alleys, but the warm, flickering shadow cast by a tavern fire. She worked at the Leaky Barrel, a grimy establishment where the only things cheaper than the ale were the morals of the patrons. Kael, still operating as Crow in public, started visiting the tavern under the guise of an errand boy for a minor guild. He didn't go for the stale beer. He went for the way Elara moved, with a weary, beautiful economy of motion. She carried trays laden with tankards, navigated drunken hands, and met every crude comment with a swift, cynical retort that cut deeper than any dagger. She was 19, with dark, unbound hair and eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of misery the usurper's city could offer. One night, a heavy-handed silver guard attempted to corner her behind the bar. Kael watched, his blood running cold, ready to throw the dagger he kept strapped to his forearm. But Elara didn't need saving. She brought the edge of a pewter tankard down on the soldier's thumb with a sickening crunch. He howled, clutching his hand, and she leaned over him, her voice a low, venomous silk. "Leave the goods you can't pay for, dog, and crawl out. You buy your ale here. You don't buy the woman who pours it." The soldier stumbled out, nursing his injury. Kael felt a profound shift. This was not a damsel to be rescued. This was a survivor as sharp and dangerous as he was. The confession under the eaves. He sought her out later that week, waiting beneath the eaves of the tavern during a sudden, sharp rain shower. He offered her a slice of plum cake he managed to barter for a small, precious luxury. She accepted it warily, leaning against the damp stone wall. "What do you want, Crow? You're not like the others. You look at me like I'm a broken piece of history." Kael leaned closer, letting the rain wash the dirt from his face. "I look at you like you're the only honest thing in this whole city." He told her pieces of his story. Not the name Kael, not the title prince, but the raw, visceral pain of witnessing his mother's death, the flight, the oath. He painted a picture of a kingdom stolen by a butcher, and his own desperate need to find a way to bleed it back. Elara listened in silence, occasionally chewing thoughtfully on the cake. When he finished, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered perspective. "A king, nah?" She scoffed softly, but there was no malice in it, only resignation. "And you think if you put a different crown on, the misery ends? Valerius is a tyrant because people allow him to be. They are hungry, and they are afraid. Your father, the Ash King, he was just another failed story. He ruled with mercy and the wolves ate him alive. Mercy is worthless here, Crow. You need claws." Her brutal pragmatism was a cold salve to his wound. Thomas taught him the ideal king. Elara taught him the real kingdom. He needed both. Their bond deepened, forged in the dangerous crucible of secrets. They met in hidden corners, shared stolen moments of warmth and conversation. Kael taught Elara to read the histories Thomas gave him. Elara taught Kael the true pulse of the streets, the whispers of the guards, the mood of the merchants, the growing, subterranean network of dissent. She was the vulnerability he craved and the shield he never knew he needed. She was the only person who looked past the desperate, hungry crow and saw a flicker of the tired boy underneath. He confessed his love for her not with flowery words, but by the reckless risk of showing her where he hid the decree. A piece of parchment, he told her, that held his very life. The unyielding mentor. While his heart was tangled with Elara, Kael's mind was being relentlessly reshaped by Brother Thomas. The training shifted from purely historical to the practical application of power. "You understand the what and the why of the crown," Thomas said one day, standing over a table covered in maps and military manuals. "Now you must master the how. A king is a weapon, Kael. A complex, sharp, and perfectly balanced weapon." Thomas taught him not only tactics, the flanking maneuvers of the ancient legions, the defensibility of high ground, but strategy, the long, cruel game of politics. Valerius rules through fear. But fear is fragile. It breaks under the weight of hope. You cannot simply take his castles, you must take the loyalty of the people, one soul at a time. That, Kael, is the campaign that lasts longer than the battle. The old man also started Kael's physical training, enlisting the help of Sergeant Morlan, a disgraced veteran of the Ash King's Guard, now working as a simple dock laborer. Morlan was a man of iron and silence, whose lessons were delivered in the form of aching muscles and bruised knuckles. Morlan taught him the sword, not the polished, chivalric dueling of the nobles, but the brutal, efficient killing of the battlefield. Your blade is an extension of your intent, boy. When you meet an opponent, you don't see a man. You see a weakness, a moment of hesitation, a single point of failure. You strike there, and you strike hard. Hesitation is the death of kings. The training was a relentless cycle, hours of study with Thomas, hours of brutal sparring with Morlan, and stolen, dangerous hours with Elara. Kael was pulled between three forces: duty and history, Thomas the need to restore the crown and honor his father's legacy; brutality and survival, Morlan the need to be physically capable of taking the kingdom back; love and humanity, Elara the need to remember why he was fighting, for a world where simple acts of kindness and love were not risks. This conflicting pressure refined him. He stopped hating Thomas's harsh discipline and Morlan's bone-deep exhaustion. He began to understand that every stolen moment with Elara made the coming war more terrifying, but also more necessary. The first test of faith. The crucible of this segment arrived during a deep winter. Valerius's forces, sensing a rising restlessness in the city, doubled down on their oppression. They arrested dozens of suspected dissidents, common folk who had done little more than complain of their hunger. Among those arrested was the father of a young girl Kael often shared his meager earnings with. The man was to be publicly interrogated and executed in the central square to send a message. Kael, fueled by the memory of his mother's murder, wanted to rush out, sword drawn, and carve his way to the gallows. It was pure, raw vengeance. Thomas stopped him, placing a hand of surprising strength on his arm. "You are not a vigilante, Kael. You are an army in waiting. To save one man now is to lose the chance to save thousands later. A king must choose the good of the many over the anguish of the few. And what kind of king stands by while his people are murdered?" Kael snarled, the crow fighting desperately to resurface. A living one, Thomas responded calmly. A king who understands that his life is no longer his own. It belongs to Erthos. Today, we send a message of subtlety. We do not save the father, but we save his legacy. Under Thomas's cold, tactical direction, Kael, Elara, and a few small, loyal hands executed a complicated maneuver. They did not attack the guards. Instead, they focused on propaganda. Just hours before the execution, they scattered hundreds of small, carefully copied pamphlets throughout the city. These pamphlets were not calls to riot. They were brief, elegantly written accounts of King Gareth's true reforms, the plans that Valerius had buried, and a single, small sigil, the forgotten crest of the Ash King's lineage. The execution still happened. The father died. Kael watched from the shadows, the agony of fresh acid in his stomach. But as the crowd dispersed, they did not scatter in total defeat. They were silent, but many held the crumpled pamphlets close. They now had a name to the hope they sought, a truth to hold against the usurper's lies. Kael had sacrificed his immediate desire for vengeance for a long-term strategic gain. It was the hardest lesson of his life, but as he stood there, feeling the icy winter wind bite his exposed skin, he realized the terrifying truth. He was starting to think like a king. A king who understood that the true forge of truth was not the hammer on the anvil, but the patient, agonizing shaping of the people's belief. He was ready for the next step. He was ready to leave the shadows of the city and seek out the allies his father had left behind. He was ready for exile. We must now turn our gaze from the shadows where hope breeds to the gilded cage where power resides, the court of Lord Valerius, the usurper. Kael's story is one of desperation and defiance, but Valerius's story is one of cold, absolute control. To understand the enemy is to understand the scope of Kael's impossible task. Valerius did not seize the throne in a fit of passionate rage. He took it with the precise, methodical ruthlessness of a surgeon claiming a limb. His heart was not driven by malice, but by a chilling conviction that only his iron fist could save Erthos from the gentle, disastrous hand of King Gareth. The man behind the iron. Lord Valerius was nearing 50, but time seemed to have paused for him, not out of youthfulness, but out of sheer, unbending will. His hair was streaked with silver, his features sharp, almost ascetic. He carried himself not like a boisterous tyrant, but like a weary priest burdened by an awful, necessary duty. This was his most dangerous weapon, the belief, genuine and unshakable, that he was right. He did not feast in excess, he ate simple meals. He did not chase petty pleasures, he worked 16 hours a day, reviewing tax ledgers and troop deployments. He was, in his own mind, the king Erthos deserved, strong, efficient, and utterly unforgiving of weakness. He had achieved stability, a cold, brittle stability built on fear and centralized control. The roads were clear of bandits. The markets, though sparsely stocked, were orderly. But this order came at a profound cost. Every noble house was indebted to him. Every church elder preached his divine right. And the tax on the common folk, the blood tribute, ensured that no one had enough reserve to contemplate rebellion. The great hall of the capital, once a place of vibrant, messy diplomacy under King Gareth, was now a silent monument to dread. The sunlight that streamed through the high, arched windows seemed incapable of warming the room. Courtiers moved like ghosts, their whispers dying before they reached the tapestries. They knew Valerius judged all things by one measure: utility. If you served his purpose, you lived well. If you became redundant, you disappeared. The engine of tyranny, Valerius's lieutenants. Valerius did not rule alone. He was supported by a triumvirate of power that made his tyranny an institution. First, Commander Lysander, the executioner of the guard. Lysander was the physical embodiment of Valerius's cruelty. He was a mountain of a man, scarred and silent, who commanded the Silver Guard. He lived for order and saw dissent not as a political problem, but as a flaw in the national machine that needed violent correction. It was Lysander who led the purge after Gareth's fall. It was Lysander who likely oversaw the murder of Kael's mother. He instilled terror by example, often executing entire families for the transgressions of one member. He was the hammer. Second, High Steward Malachi, the architect of the coffers. Malachi was the intellectual backbone of the tyranny. Thin, pale, and constantly dressed in silk, he controlled the flow of every copper piece in the kingdom. He engineered the ruinous tax structure, cleverly targeting the old, landed nobility, those most likely to cling to Gareth's memory, until they had no choice but to sell their titles and loyalty to Valerius. He was a genius of bureaucracy and financial strangulation. He was the chain. Third, Cardinal Vesper, the voice of false prophecy. Vesper was perhaps the most insidious of all. Valerius understood that fear alone does not sustain a dynasty. You need divine approval. Vesper, once a disgraced bishop, was elevated by Valerius to the highest seat of the church. He rewrote scripture, preaching that Gareth's mercy was a sin and that Valerius's iron rule was God's righteous punishment for the kingdom's prior decadence. His sermons turned loyalty into religious dogma, crippling the moral resistance of the devout commoners. He was the spirit poison, the plague of apathy. The most devastating impact of Valerius's rule, however, was not the outright cruelty, but the pervasive apathy it bred. Valerius had perfected the art of making the citizenry complicit in their own oppression. When the harvest failed, he did not just seize grain. He forced neighbors to report on neighbors who were hoarding or hiding food. When a noble house was ruined, he sold off their lands cheaply, creating a new class of small landowners who owed their entire existence to his continuing reign. This fostered an environment where suspicion was currency, and self-preservation trumped all morality. If you were silent, if you worked hard, and if you denounced your rebellious neighbor, you might survive another season. This system made Kael's efforts to raise a rebellion nearly impossible. Why risk your life for a dead king's son when the consequence for failure was the brutal extinction of your entire line? This atmosphere also provided the perfect cover for a nascent rebellion. Valerius and his lieutenants were so confident in the strength of their internal control, so focused on eliminating any overt threat, that they tended to overlook the quiet, subtle rot of dissent that Kael and Elara were nurturing. the serpent and the shadow. In the midst of this sterile control, Valerius faced only two constant threats: the shadow of the decree that proved his usurpation, and the rising menace of the northern Iron Fist clans, hardy, independent mountain warriors who refused to bend the knee or pay the tribute. Valerius dedicated enormous resources to finding the decree and the missing heir, a hunt led tirelessly by Commander Lysander. They searched every forgotten monastery, interrogated every former servant, and slaughtered every alleged loyalist. Their certainty that the heir was dead was the only comfort Valerius allowed himself. In a rare moment of reflection, standing alone in the massive, cold throne room, Valerius confessed his burden to Malachi. "They call me usurper, Malachi. But I did not steal this throne. I saved it from drowning in sentiment. Gareth wept over every decision, I calculate. And when the history books are finally written, they will not speak of my cruelty, but of the strength that saved Erthos from itself." He saw his regime not as an act of treason, but as a necessary and painful national surgery. And he would cut out any infection, whether it be a starving peasant or a vengeful boy, to preserve his vision of order. Kael, the Prince of the Shadows, was about to step out of the capital. But Valerius's long arm of control stretched far beyond the city walls, armed not just with steel, but with gold, bureaucracy, and the crippling weight of religious decree. Kael was walking into the wilderness, but he was still profoundly within the prison of the usurper's making. The real war would not be fought over fortresses, but over the hearts and minds Valerius had so skillfully convinced to fear hope more than despair. The time had come to exchange the safety of the shadows for the risk of the road. Kael was 18 now, a man built from equal parts training, desperation, and the sheer, stubborn memory of his mother's scream. The capital was a school, the kingdom was to be his trial. His mission, Thomas explained, was not a raid for gold or a grand battle. It was a pilgrimage of faith. Before he fell, your father, King Gareth, sent his most trusted general, Lord Varus, to the fortress city of Ironhold on the western frontier, Thomas explained, pointing to a rough location on the map. Varus holds a scroll, a list of every noble house, every powerful churchman, and every guild master who secretly swore allegiance to your line. A loyalty forged in the fires of Valerius's betrayal. This list, the Varus scroll, was their key. Without it, Kael was just an ambitious street thug. With it, he was the magnet for 1,000 loyal swords. The mission was simple on the surface: travel 300 miles through Valerius-controlled territory, reach Ironhold, secure the scroll, and return. The complication was the man chosen to accompany Kael, Sergeant Morlan. Morlan, the grizzled, silent veteran who had taught Kael the deadly art of the blade, was no longer fit for a mission of stealth. He was slow, his joints stiff, and his face was too recognizable to Valerius's older commanders. But he was fiercely loyal, and he insisted on going. The crow knows the city, but Kael the king knows nothing of the open road, Morlan rasped, cleaning his massive, scarred broadsword. You need a shield against the wild and a lesson in humility against the guards. I am both, Thomas Weary agreed. Lyra, however, was terrified. the farewell in the rain. Their final meeting was in the crypt where the decree was buried. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with foreboding. Lyra held Kael's face in her hands, her eyes searching his for a promise he couldn't make. They hunt you, Kael. Every mile is a thread they can pull to find you. Why can't we wait? Let Thomas do the planning, while we gather more whispers here. Because time is Valerius's ally, Kael replied, holding her tightly, feeling her fear like a physical weight. Every season we wait, another noble house is swallowed by his tax collectors. Every winter we linger, another generation forgets the name Gareth. I need the scroll, Lyra. I need the names. Without them, I lead a ghost army. She didn't argue. She knew his duty was the third partner in their relationship. Then go, she whispered, pulling back just enough to slip a small, tarnished silver locket around his neck. It was empty. This is a broken thing, Kael. Like us. But bring it back. If you live, you bring it back to me. Don't let your king's duty become your executioner. He kissed her, a deep, desperate sealing of an uncertain future, and then he was gone, slipping out of the city gates with Morlun under the cover of a thick, persistent midnight rain. The journey northward. The road was a ruthless teacher. Morlun taught Kael how to navigate by the stars, how to make a fire that gave heat but little smoke, and how to read the fear in a farmer's face. They moved by night and hid by day, adopting the guise of traveling tinkers, a cover that offered just enough legitimacy to avoid immediate suspicion. Kael found the weight of the kingdom pressing down on him. Morlun was often difficult, criticizing Kael's every mistake with brutal honesty. You hesitate, boy. The sword does not hesitate, the man does. You must separate the two, Morlun snapped after Kael nearly lost a sparring match to a stray branch. I am learning patience, not hesitation, Kael retorted, nursing a bruised rib. Patience is for politicians. You are a man on a mission of life or death. The moment you see an advantage, you take it. You cannot afford the mercy your father clung to. It will be your ruin. Morlun's words were a constant, painful reminder of the sacrifice required. The journey was long and physically agonizing, but the mental journey was harder. Kael was constantly fighting the urge to run back to Lyra, to abandon the burden of his lineage, and simply be Crow again. Irehold, and the trap. After weeks of travel, they reached Irehold, a massive, ancient fortress built into the cliffs overlooking a roaring river. They approached it with caution. The city felt wrong, too quiet, too orderly. Posing as merchants, they gained entry to the outer city. Kael used an old cipher Thomas had taught him, transmitting a coded message to the barracks where Lord Varys was housed. The reply came back swiftly, delivered by a frantic, young stable boy. Lord Varys is waiting. Go to the western watchtower at midnight. Come alone. Kael immediately felt the cold knot of suspicion. Alone? He questioned Morlun. Varys knows the risks. Why ask the heir to separate from his only guard? Morlun's eyes narrowed, his face etched with concern. It is a clear warning, Kael. Either Varys suspects his own men and seeks absolute secrecy, or, It is a trap set by Lysander. Kael looked at the sprawling, oppressive walls of Ironhold. He had come too far to turn back. He knew the cost of retreat. I must go. If it's a trap, the scroll is lost forever. If it is Varus, then the army is won. Then I will be the sacrifice, Morland stated, his voice devoid of emotion. You are the future, Kael. I am the past. I will draw their attention to the north gate 1 hour before your meeting. A diversion. Give me a clear target, a piece of Valerius's property to burn. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs. He understood the terrible logic. Morland was knowingly accepting his death sentence to clear a path for his king. No, Kael said firmly. I will not buy my kingdom with the life of the last loyal man. We go together, or we find another way. But Morland was the man who had taught him the harsh arithmetic of war. He simply smiled, a grim, terrible expression Kael had never seen on his face before. You already agreed, boy. You learned that a king must choose the good of the many. I am the few. I am the broken blade that buys you the scroll. Go to the watchtower, Kael. I will see to the diversion. The broken blade. At 11 o'clock, Kael watched from the shadows as Morland, donning a piece of the Ash King's heraldry he'd secretly carried, walked deliberately toward the massive, heavily guarded north gate. Kael wanted to scream, to run, to pull his friend back. But he was frozen by Thomas's voice echoing in his mind. Hate is fire. You must be fueled by justice. Morland reached the gate, drew his massive broadsword, and with a roar that tore the quiet night apart, a roar that shouted Kael's defiance, he plunged his blade not into a guard, but into a stack of Valerius's new, highly taxed grain sacks, spilling their precious contents onto the ground. The reaction was instantaneous and vicious. The silver guards swarmed him. Kael heard the ringing of steel, the shouts of the soldiers, and the terrible, rhythmic thud of multiple blades meeting flesh. Morland was a wall of iron and fury, fighting with the sublime skill of a man who had already accepted his end, but there was no winning. There was only delaying. Kael ran. He ran not toward Morland, but toward the western watchtower, fueled by a grief so profound it threatened to shatter his resolve. He reached the watchtower and scaled the rope ladder. Lord Varus was there, waiting, but Varus was not alone. Standing beside him was Commander Lysander, the executioner of the guard. The scroll was on the table. The trap was sprung. The loyal General Varus delivered you right into our hands, boy, Lysander sneered, his helmet glinting in the dark. We knew Gareth's blood was sentimental. You came for a list of names, and you came alone. Lysander didn't know Morland had been the diversion. The diversion that was now silent. Varus, his face pale with shame and sorrow, nodded slowly. Forgive me, my prince. They threatened my family. I had no choice. Kael looked at Varus, then at the scroll, then past Lysander, imagining Morland's final, honorable stand. The hatred he had contained for 8 years exploded. It was not the time for strategy or politics. It was the time for the crow. Kael didn't speak. He drew his knife, not the broadsword, but the quick, unseen blade of the street fighter. He lunged, not at Lysander, the towering warrior, but at Varus, the traitor. Varus, shocked by the sudden, brutal speed, barely raised his arms. Kael's knife found its target, not his throat, but the treacherous hand that had helped set the snare. As Varus screamed, Kael snatched the scroll and plunged out of the high window, leaping onto the roof of the adjacent building. He ran from Ironhold under the pale dawn light, the precious scroll clutched in one hand, the sound of Morland's final battle ringing like a mournful, terrible bell in his ears. He had the list. He had the key to his kingdom. But he had paid for it with the life of his shield, and he now carried the weight of a king who had chosen the many over the few. The broken blade of honor, Morland, was gone, and Kael's heart was officially scarred for war. We are perfectly on track. Kael now possesses the Varus scroll but is alone, hunted, and spiritually broken. His next journey takes him to a place where he must forge new alliances out of sheer necessity. The escape from Ironhold was not a victory, it was an amputation. Kael was alive, and the Varus scroll was his, but the cost, Morland's sacrifice, had cracked something fundamental in his soul. He had chosen the kingdom over the man, and the guilt was a heavy chain dragging at his heels. He did not run towards the capital, where Lyra waited, for that would endanger her and the scroll. He ran into the only place Valerius's writ held little authority, the northern crags. These mountains were not the picturesque peaks of ballads. They were brutal, unforgiving walls of stone and ice, ruled by a people as hard and unyielding as their home. These were the Iron Fist clans, an ancient, semi-nomadic confederation who had always scorned the softer kingdoms of the south. They paid no taxes to Valerius, and offered him only cold silence. The hunter and the hunted. Kael traveled for days, moving like a hunted animal. He avoided the roads, scaled dangerous ridges, and lived off the meager, frozen offerings of the wilderness. He learned to trust the snow not to betray his scent, and the silence not to conceal an enemy. The physical hardship was a welcome distraction from the mental agony. Every blister, every shivering night, was a penance for Morland. The chase was relentless. Commander Lysander was incensed by Kael's escape and the humiliation of the trap at Ironhold. He sent scouting parties of the Silver Guard deep into the foothills, offering massive rewards for the Ash King's whelp. One evening, exhausted and famished, Kael was cornered by 3 scouts. They had been tracking him for hours, their well-fed horses and superior gear closing the gap. Kael fought with the savage desperation of the crow, not the refined technique of the prince. He dispatched one with the speed Thomas had taught him, but the other 2 were powerful and fresh. Just as a blade was arcing toward his neck, a whistle, sharp and piercing, sliced through the mountain air. From the rocks above, a storm of thick, barbed arrows rained down. They were aimed with deadly precision, not at Kael, but to disable the Silver Guard, pinning their arms or piercing their horses. A moment later, 2 figures dropped silently from the cliffs. They were cloaked in thick furs and leather, armed with massive, heavy axes and short, powerful hunting bows. They moved with a raw, predatory competence that made Kael's street skills look like parlor games. They dispatched the wounded guards swiftly and brutally, then turned their cold, assessing eyes on Kael. They didn't speak the common tongue of Erthos, but a guttural, ancient dialect. The Law of the Stone Heart. Kael was dragged, half-conscious, high into the mountains to the main settlement of the Iron Fist clan, nestled in a hidden caldera. It was a brutal place. Homes were hewn from the living rock, smoke curled constantly from open fires, and the people were lean, weathered, and fiercely guarded. He was brought before Ragnar, the Stoneheart, the chieftain of the largest clan. Ragnar was an enormous man whose beard was braided with silver rings and whose face looked like it had been carved by the mountain winds. He regarded Kael with profound, skeptical apathy. "You are soft-boned," Ragnar pronounced in heavily accented Arthosian, his voice like rocks grinding together. "A southern thing. A whisper from the kingdom that failed itself." Kael, standing tall despite his exhaustion, refused to bow. He pulled the Varus scroll from his hidden pouch and held it out. "I am Kael, son of Gareth. I am the rightful king of Erthos," he said, his voice ringing with the authority Thomas had labored to instill. "And I have not come to bow. I have come to trade." Ragnar was unmoved by the claim to the throne. "A king is a fool who taxes his own people. Your father begged for our allegiance. We gave him silence. We will give you the same. You gave Valerius silence too," Kael countered, stepping closer. "But silence is not a shield. Valerius has begun mining the eastern foothills, your ancestral iron mines. He does not ask for tribute, he takes your land. Your silence will soon be a grave." This struck a nerve. The air in the cavernous hall crackled. "We will fight him when he comes," Ragnar spat. "And you will die when he comes," Kael retorted, the brutal pragmatism of Lyra guiding his tongue. "Valerius has disciplined armies, steel, and endless gold. You have courage and axes. It is not enough. But I have what you do not, the names." He unfolded the Varus scroll, not to show the names, but the elegant, old script. "This is a list of every greedy, powerful man who swore to my father and who still hates Valerius. Bishops, generals, guild masters. If you shelter me, if you train me, and if you lend me your axe, I will unite the south and bleed Valerius dry from the inside out. When I take the throne, your minds remain yours. Your laws remain yours. You will pay no tax, you will owe no fealty. You will owe me only an alliance of equals." Ragnar leaned back, a flicker of interest in his eye. Kael hadn't asked for loyalty. He had offered a fair, necessary exchange. He understood the language of the mountains, strength, and a shared enemy. Forging the Iron Fist King. The clans agreed to a trial. Kael was granted protection, but he was given no pity. His life among the Iron Fist was a living crucible designed to burn away the last vestiges of the soft, southern prince. He was stripped of his fine leather clothes and given the thick, scratchy wool and furs of the clansmen. He was forced to learn their language, their ways of hunting the mountain stag, and their brutal, primal form of combat. His training with Morlun had been structured and technical. His training with Ragnar's daughter, Anya, was an act of sheer will. Anya was the clan's war leader, a woman who moved with the strength of a glacier. She treated Kael with open contempt, seeing him as a spoiled pet. "Your hands are quick, southern thing, but your heart is slow," Anya would snarl, driving him onto the frozen ground again and again during sparring. "You fight to survive. We fight to dominate. There is a difference." She forced him to wrestle barehanded with mountain bears they had trapped. She sent him on solo hunts for days with no fire and only a single, blunt knife. Kael learned that he was not just fighting Valerius. He was fighting his own inherent weakness. He started to thrive. He adapted the Iron Fist's heavy axe technique with the agility of his street knife, creating a hybrid, deadly style. He learned to read the weather, the snow, and the intent behind a man's eyes. He slowly earned respect. He never once complained. He worked twice as hard as any clansman, always rising first, always taking the heaviest burden. His grief for Morlun, once paralyzing, was slowly being reforged into the raw fuel for this new endurance. The scars that tell the truth. One night, sitting around the massive central fire, Kael asked Ragnar about the Ash King. Ragnar merely grunted. Gareth was a good man. Too much like soft snow. He saw the world as it should be. Valerius sees the world as it is. That is the difference between a king who fails and a king who endures. Kael, now 18, stripped of everything but his purpose, understood the profound truth in that assessment. His father's mercy was beautiful, but it had led to death. Valerius's cruelty was monstrous, but it had brought a brittle, false stability. Kael realized his crown must be a synthesis of both, mercy with an iron hand. He spent 9 long months in the northern crags. When he descended the mountain slopes, he was no longer Kael, the prince, or Crow, the thief. He was a man with the discipline of a scholar, the eye of a general, the heart of a lover, and the deep, silent resilience of the mountain stone. He had scars on his face, scars on his hands, and the deepest scar, Morlun's death, etched into his soul. He had forged his alliance with the Iron Fist clans. Now, he was ready to use the Vera scroll and plunge back into the south, prepared to face the next, inevitable step, the deep, consuming winter of doubt. Kael descended from the northern crags a different man, carrying the cold resolve of the mountains beneath his worn furs. The Varus scroll was his map, and the allegiance of the Iron Fist clans was his weapon, but he knew the greatest battles were yet to be fought in the murky valleys of politics and the desolate landscape of his own heart. He established his hidden base of operations in the ruins of an old hunting lodge deep within the Blackwood Forest, a massive, sprawling wood rumored to be haunted, thus ignored by Valerius's men. This was to be his headquarters during the long, paralyzing period he called the Winter of Doubt. The isolation of command. Kael was no longer the lone fugitive. He was the center of a fragile, burgeoning movement. Brother Thomas joined him, bringing his endless knowledge and cautious counsel. Anya, daughter of Ragnar, came with 5 of the strongest Iron Fist warriors, their presence a promise and a fierce challenge to Kael's authority. Most importantly, Lyra returned, risking her life to slip out of the capital. her intelligence on the movements of the Silver Guard and the shifting moods of the commoners was invaluable. But Kael, surrounded by his loyal few, had never felt more isolated. Command was a lonely throne. He had traded the simple hunger of crow for the complex, sickening hunger of duty. He spent weeks poring over the Varus scroll. The names were a terrifying mix: minor lords desperate for land, powerful merchant families crippled by Valerius's taxes, and even a few disgraced officers from the Silver Guard. Each name was a potential ally, but also a potential traitor. Thomas urged caution. "We must test them, Kael. Valerius has 1,000 ways to turn loyalty into a noose. We send coded messages, we request small, anonymous acts of defiance. We do not risk the kingdom on a signed paper." Kael agreed, but the slow, agonizing pace chafed at his mountain-forged impatience. Every day spent in caution was another day Valerius was solidifying his grip, another day the people suffered. The conflict of mercy and necessity. The moral cost of his war began to weigh heavily. The core of his purpose was justice, avenging his mother and restoring freedom. Yet, every tactical decision he made seemed to require an act that compromised that justice. The clans needed gold to sustain their winter camp and their families back home. The only way to get it was to raid a shipment of tax revenue, money Malachi had extorted from the poorest farming communities. Kael knew this money, if stolen, would be instantly replaced by Valerius through further, cruel taxation on the very people Kael sought to save. But without the gold, his forces would starve or disperse. He presented the dilemma to his council. "If we take the tax gold, we fund our revolution, but we inflict more immediate pain on the farmers. If we leave it, the farmers suffer anyway, and we lose the chance to arm ourselves." Anya, the Iron Fist warrior, was pragmatic. "War is fire, Kael. We burn the village to save the city. Take the gold. The people will forgive the prince who robs them to become the king who frees them." Lyra's eyes were shadowed with pain. "Anya speaks the truth of war, Kael. But the people you are saving are the same people who will be beaten and starved when Valerius replaces the funds. Do not break their hope just to fill your coffers. Find another way." Thomas, the strategist, offered the darkest choice. "Use the gold, Kael. But use the act of the theft. Do not allow Valerius to simply replace the loss. Use the theft to create dissent. Rob the gold, then leave a sign that Valerius's corrupt officers were responsible. Turn their hunger against them." Kael chose Thomas's path, the path of necessary deception and moral complexity. He orchestrated the raid perfectly, with the clans executing the strike and Lyra providing the critical, false documentation that implicated a corrupt Silver Guard captain. The gold was secured, but the shadow of that choice clung to Kael. He had used the lie as his first official weapon. The cost of leadership, he was learning, was the slow loss of innocence. The love that is a leash. Kael's greatest internal struggle centered on Lyra. Her presence was his only solace, the single thread connecting him to the idea of a normal, peaceful life. Yet, every moment they shared was a profound liability. One evening, by the flickering hearth in the lodge, Lyra spoke of their future, painting a small, fragile picture of a quiet life after the war, a small cottage, a field of their own, no crowns, no politics. Kael listened, his heart aching with the beauty of the impossible dream. But he had changed. The winter of doubt had chilled his soul, replacing passion with cold, calculated resolve. You speak of retreat, Lyra. I speak of necessity, he said, his voice flat. The king I must become cannot afford a small cottage. He must command a castle, defend a crown, and carry the weight of the people. I cannot promise you peace. I can only promise you I will not stop until the usurper falls. She understood. She understood his isolation, but she feared the coldness that was starting to encase him. I did not ask you to stop, Kael. I asked you to remember. Do not let your duty to the crown consume the heart that fights for the people. Your father forgot his humanity in his grief. Don't let your revenge become a throne built of ice. Her warning was a painful echo of Thomas's, yet Lyra's fear was much more personal. She feared losing him not to death, but to the very ambition that drove him. He knew she was right. His love for her was the one weakness Valerius could exploit, but it was also the only reason he hadn't yet become as cold and cruel as his enemy. It was the only light in the Blackwood. The decision of the banner. As spring approached, the clandestine network established by the Varus scroll began to bear fruit. Secret meetings took place in darkened manners, coded letters passed through the hands of sympathetic merchants, and the gold secured from the raids started buying weapons and supplies. The nobles, tired of Valerius's taxes and the suffocating atmosphere of fear, needed Kael to prove he was more than a rumor. They needed a symbol. They needed a public risk. Thomas gave him the final command. The season of planning ends now, Kael. You have the men, the gold, and the allies. If you linger in the shadows any longer, they will assume you are a coward, and they will turn you in to save themselves. You must stop fighting shadows and fight the light. Kael stood at the heart of the ruined lodge, holding a fragile banner, the crest of the Ash King, carefully restored by Thomas. He looked at the faces around him, the grim determination of Anya, the weary wisdom of Thomas, the fearful love of Lyra. He thought of Morland's death, his mother's scream, and the freezing cold of the drainage tunnel. He realized the winter of doubt had served its purpose. It had stripped away his youthful certainty and replaced it with a measured, grim resilience. He was ready to stop surviving and start fighting. We march south, Kael commanded, his voice deep and steady, filled with the resonance of a man who has accepted his fate. We will ride out of the Blackwood and raise this banner on the highest point we can find. We will give the commoners a sight to give them hope, and we will give Valerius a name to curse. The winter of doubt was over. It was time for the king to raise his own storm. The Blackwood forest had been a sanctuary, but sanctuaries rot if lingered in too long. Kael, now 20 years old, felt the urgency of the kingdom's expectation, the silent plea of the Varus scroll's names. He had to exchange the whispers of conspiracy for the roar of open defiance. The strategic target was the ancient, abandoned tower of Mount Lyra, a rugged sentinel overlooking the vast, Central Plains. It was difficult to assault, impossible to ignore, and crucially, far enough from Valerius's main garrisons to allow a clean strike and retreat. The ascent of defiance. Kael's force was small, but perfectly honed. 12 Iron Fist warriors, silent and deadly, led by Anya, Brother Thomas, his strategist, serving as the voice of caution, and Lyra, whose knowledge of the local trails and patrols was indispensable. They moved with brutal efficiency. The Iron Fist scaled the cliffs of Mount Lyra under the cover of a dense, swirling morning fog, neutralizing the small garrison Valerius had placed there, a company of bored, arrogant conscripts, before the sun had even touched the eastern sky. The action was swift, silent, and without mercy. Kael took no prisoners. He remembered Morland's lesson: in a war for survival, clemency is a weakness. As the fog burned away, Kael stood atop the ruined watchtower, looking down at the world that had cast him out. The vast plains spread beneath him, fields that were once fertile now lying fallow, choked by the usurper's taxes. Thomas raised the banner of the Ash King. It was a simple, stark sigil, a hawk rising from a field of dark slate gray. As the silk caught the crisp morning wind, it snapped like a gunshot, announcing their presence to the kingdom. It was not a military victory. It was an assertion of existence. The first messenger. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. Within hours, messengers, merchants, and spies from every corner of Erthos were racing toward the capital. 1,000 whispered conversations had suddenly been given a voice. The son of the Ash King was not dead. He was standing on a mountain peak, and he was demanding attention. Valerius's reaction was measured, but lethal. He did not dispatch a grand army. He sent a single, powerful message led by Sir Gregor, a renowned veteran knight fiercely loyal to the usurper, commanding 200 highly trained silver guard. Valerius's orders were clear: capture the pretender alive, execute every single follower, and return the banner, stained with their blood. This was not a battle. It was a public lesson. Kael, having raised his challenge, knew the price was now due. They had to hold the tower long enough for the news to spread, then escape the inevitable encirclement. The siege of stone and steel. Sir Gregor arrived within 2 days, his forces surrounding the base of Mount Lyra. He did not charge the tower. He employed the classic tactic of siege warfare: patience and strangulation. He cut off the water and supply lines and waited for Kael's small band to wither under thirst and hunger. Kael used the waiting time to address his people, his first true address as a leader. He spoke not of his mother's murder, nor of his suffering, but of their shared future. "They wait for us to starve," Kael said, standing before his troops. Iron Fist, loyalists from the Varus Scroll who had managed to join him, and a handful of disillusioned peasantry. "They believe we are common bandits fighting for gold. We must show them we are an idea fighting for freedom." The fight began with a devastating display of the Iron Fist's skill. As the Silver Guard attempted to scale the lower walls, Anya led a furious counter-assault, driving them back with heavy axes and precise archery. It was a baptism of fire for the new, southern recruits, but Kael was everywhere, fighting not just as a commander, but as a tireless warrior, his movements a blend of Morland's technique and Anya's brutality. He killed swiftly, cleanly, and with a terrible calm. He was no longer fighting with hate, he was fighting with purpose. The cost of victory. But the Silver Guard were relentless. They renewed their assault, and the fighting became brutal, hand-to-hand combat on the narrow stairwells of the tower. In the midst of the chaos, Thomas, the scholar, the mentor, was wounded. He had been assisting the archers, using his knowledge of geometry and wind patterns to guide their shots, but a stray arrow caught him in the shoulder. Kael fought his way to the old man, his face smeared with blood and grime. Thomas, pale and shaking, refused to yield his post. "It is nothing, my king," Thomas gasped, clutching his wound. "A scratch. The fight is the thing." But the injury slowed him. A moment later, when the Silver Guard attempted a final push up the main stairs, Thomas was too slow to react. A massive, steel-clad Silver Guard captain lunged at Kael. Thomas, knowing the single price of Kael's life, threw himself forward. The captain's sword, meant for Kael, buried itself deep into Thomas's side. Kael's cry was animalistic. He spun, his axe a blur, shearing the captain's head from his shoulders. But it was too late. He knelt beside Thomas, the battle momentarily irrelevant. Thomas's breath was ragged, his slate-colored eyes fixed on Kael. "The banner, Kael," Thomas wheezed, weakly gesturing toward the defiant flag whipping above them. "It is the truth. Never surrender the truth. And never, never repeat your father's mercy." He closed his eyes. The last loyal man who knew Kael as a child, the man who had educated a prince and shaped a king, was gone. Kael felt the paralyzing cold of grief, a familiar, agonizing knife. The kingdom had taken his mother, his soldier, and now his teacher. He stood up, his face a mask of iron, and let out a command that silenced the entire battlefield. Retreat and the thunder of the king. Kael had his victory, but it tasted of ash. Sir Gregor's forces were broken, their commander captured, their resolve shattered by the ferocity of the Iron Fist and the new king's own killing fury. Kael looked at Gregor, the captured knight, and saw not an enemy, but the face of the price he had to pay. He tied the captured knight to the central staff of the tower, then pinned the banner of the Ash King to Gregor's chest with a ceremonial dagger. "Tell your usurper," Kael commanded, his voice raw with loss, "that I have paid the price of the banner with the blood of my mentor, and now he will pay the price of his tyranny with the death of his lieutenants. The king has come." He ordered the Iron Fist to torch the tower, turning the summit of Mount Lyra into a massive, visible signal fire. Then, they retreated into the darkness, carrying Thomas's body with them. Kael rode away, the captured scroll secure, the fire blazing behind him. He had won his first skirmish, established his name, and tasted the terrible, agonizing price of the banner. Thomas's final lesson, to be merciless when necessary, was now etched in blood upon his soul. He had earned his legitimacy, but the victory felt heavier than any defeat. The public defiance at Mount Lyra had achieved its goal. The nobles named in the Varus scroll could no longer sit on the fence. They were forced to choose. And now, swords were being drawn across the southern and western territories of Erthos. Kael's small force swelled with eager, if untrained, volunteers. The war had begun in earnest. Kael's next move was a bold one, chosen to inflict maximum strategic and psychological damage: the capture of Serpent's Gate. Serpent's Gate was a massive, tripartite fortress controlling the only viable trade route between the rich western farmlands and the usurper's capital. To take it was to starve the capital of food and gold. To fail was to lose all credibility gained at Mount Lyra. The arrival of the wolf. Valerius, his calculated calm finally breaking, knew he could not lose Serpent's Gate. He did not, however, send Commander Lysander, whom he now saw as predictable. Instead, he dispatched his most brilliant and most terrifying military mind, Lady Isolde of House Vane. Isolde was a contradiction. Barely 30, she was known throughout the kingdom as the Wolf of the West, a master strategist who never lost a battle and never showed clemency. She was not a brute like Lysander. She was a genius of logistics and morale. She possessed the cold, unfeeling tactical mind of a chess master, sacrificing pieces without remorse to secure the king. She was the distillation of Valerius's cruelty applied with ruthless intelligence. When Kael's forces, a ragged mix of Iron Fist veterans, newly armed peasants, and a handful of lesser noble riders, arrived at Serpent's Gate, they found Isolde already in command. She hadn't just reinforced the fortress, she had studied Kael's recent actions. She knew Kael relied on speed and the element of surprise. She had prepared a trap. The lure of weakness. The fortress had 3 distinct sections: the Viper's Head, the main keep, the Scales, the fortified village outside the walls, and the tail, a vulnerable, smaller south gate. Kael, using intelligence from Lyra's network, planned to concentrate his attack on the tail, a section that appeared deceptively weak. But as the battle began, Kael realized the weakness was an invitation. The defense at the tailgate was thin, but the moment Kael's primary force rushed the wall, Isolde sprung her attack. From hidden trenches flanking the gate, hundreds of fresh Silver Guard troops boiled up, perfectly positioned to cut off Kael's vanguard. At the same moment, the main keep opened its massive iron gates, sending a cavalry charge, the wolf's teeth, around the flanks. Kael's army was about to be surrounded, crushed, and routed. Anya, fighting with the savage fury of the mountains, fought desperately to hold the line, but Kael watched in horror as his men, many of whom were fathers and farmers, began to break and flee under the crushing pressure. "She's studied us. She knows the way the Iron Fists fight," Kael roared, struggling to pivot his troops. The turning of the tide. He had to break her pattern. He had to stop fighting the battle she had planned and force her into one she hadn't. Kael saw the only path to survival lay in the Scales, the fortified village outside the walls. Isolde had largely ignored this section, using it as a supply and staging area, relying on the walls of the main keep for defense. Kael looked at Lyra, who was riding beside him, her face streaked with fear and mud, but her eyes bright with grim resolve. The scales. It's the soft center. If we can burn her supplies, she loses her patience and has to commit her main force. Lyra nodded, understanding the sheer recklessness of the move. She gathered a dozen of the swiftest riders, many of them former smugglers, and slipped away, tasked with the near impossible mission of infiltrating the scales and setting the essential supply tents ablaze. Kael, meanwhile, led a desperate, suicidal charge away from the tailgate and toward the Viper's head, drawing the entire attention of the Silver Guard cavalry. The battle became a personal duel in chaos. Kael, on horseback, fought with a frenzied, strategic recklessness, his axe a whirling arc of death, targeting the officers, not the common soldiers. He was no longer just fighting. He was performing an act of defiance designed to draw the wolf's attention away from the flock. The wolf's countermove. The strategy was working. Kael's charge stalled the cavalry, and Isolde, watching from the battlements, saw her crushing encirclement falter. But she was not a woman to be rattled. Suddenly, a massive column of smoke billowed up from the direction of the scales. Lyra had succeeded. The scent of burning grain and melting tallow carried across the battlefield, a massive blow to the fortress's endurance. Isolde's reaction was swift and terrifying. She didn't panic. She simply calculated the new cost. She ordered the main gate of the Viper's head closed and locked, sacrificing the remaining Silver Guard cavalry still outside the fortress walls to preserve her core fighting force and supplies. The sound of the massive, iron gate slamming shut was a chilling, absolute declaration. Isolde was ruthless enough to trade the lives of hundreds of her own men for strategic superiority. Kael's relief was mixed with horror. He had saved his army, but he had witnessed a new depth of military depravity, a cold, tactical willingness to sacrifice pawns without emotion. He knew then that Lady Isolde was his true peer in this war, and his most dangerous enemy. The price of success. With the Silver Guard cavalry suddenly abandoned by their commander, Kael and Anya brutally cut them down. The remaining forces of the usurper retreated into the fortress, sealed behind the iron gate. Kael stood before the walls of Serpent's Gate. He had survived the ambush. He had driven back the enemy. He had destroyed their supplies. But he had not taken the fortress. The victory was hollowed out by the realization that Isolde had paid a higher price in blood to ensure the integrity of the keep. She had taught Kael that winning a battle is secondary to maintaining the structure of power. Kael ordered his weary troops to establish a defensive perimeter. The siege was on. He found Lyra, who had miraculously returned unharmed from the scales, her face streaked with soot and tears of adrenaline. She clung to him, the fear finally breaking her composure. "She's a monster, Kael! She left her own men to die. How can we fight something so cold?" Kael looked up at the impenetrable walls of the Viper's head, where a small figure in command armor was visible on the parapets. Isolde, the wolf. "We fight her," Kael said, his voice quiet and grim, "by learning her ruthlessness, and then matching it with a purpose she can never understand. She fights for a tyrant. We fight for a dream." The siege of the Serpent's Gate was not a clash of swords, but a duel of wills between the exiled king and the wolf of the west. Kael had won the first skirmish, but the heavy, grinding reality of the long siege, the sickness, the dwindling resources, and the gnawing paranoia, was about to begin. The true cost of his kingdom was now being tallied, paid in the lives of the fathers he had promised to save. The siege of the Serpent's Gate settled into a slow, grinding misery. Kael's army, though resilient, lacked the resources for a swift, decisive assault, and Lady Isolde was a relentless, patient defender. The stalemate was a war of attrition, fought with dwindling supplies and corrosive doubt. The true battle, Kael knew, was not against the stone walls, but against time. Valerius was mobilizing a massive relief army, led by the humiliated commander Lysander. They had perhaps 3 weeks before they were crushed between the hammer of Isolde's defense and the anvil of Lysander's reinforcements. Kael's only hope was a daring, desperate plan to infiltrate the inner keep and open the main gate from within. The mission was suicide, and only one person possessed the unique skills and deep familiarity with the keep's blueprints: Elara. The confession of necessity. Kael met Elara in the damp safety of his command tent, the maps of the keep spread between them. Her face was pale, shadowed by the lack of sleep and the weight of their impossible situation. "You know the lower levels of this keep, Elara," Kael said, his voice flat, trying to mask the churning anxiety in his stomach. "From your network's old smuggling days. Can you find a path to the hoist room? The main gate controls?" Elara looked at the map, tracing a finger over the lines of the subterranean tunnels. "The old cistern network, it's treacherous, flooded half the time. But yes, I know a way that avoids the patrol routes, if the passage hasn't caved." She looked up at him, her eyes searching. "You want me to lead the strike team, Kael? You're not asking for the route, you're asking for the sacrifice." Kael didn't flinch, yet the lie tasted like iron. "I am asking you to be the spearhead, Elara. The most important person in this war. If you succeed, we win the fortress, we survive Lysander, and we take back Erthos. No one else has your knowledge." He wrapped the conversation in duty, in necessity, in the logic of command, because to say, "I love you and I need you to risk your life for my crown," felt too cruel, too honest. The kiss of treason. Elara accepted the mission with a grim stoicism that tore at him. She was, after all, a survivor, forged in the cynicism of the city. She knew the arithmetic of war as well as he did. The infiltration was set for the night of the new moon, the deepest dark. Before she left, Elara pulled Kael into the shadow of a tent flap. "I am risking my life, Kael," she whispered, her hands cupping his face. "Not for the crown, and not for the history books. For the quiet life we promised each other." She kissed him, a kiss that felt less like love and more like a final farewell, a silent accusation of the duty that had slowly consumed them both. Just an hour later, the assault team moved out. Kael watched from the battlements as Elara and her chosen few melted into the broken landscape, slipping toward the dark, forgotten mouth of the cistern tunnel. He waited. Minutes stretched into hours, thick with tension. His heart hammered out the rhythm of his greatest fear. Then, not a success but a disaster. A flare, a brilliant silver light that tore through the black of the new moon, shot up from the exact location of the main gate. The entire keep erupted in light and alarm. Torches flared on the battlements. The harsh sound of horns and drums shattered the silence. The infiltration had been betrayed. The ambush. Kael didn't hesitate. He knew Elara was captured, or worse. He ordered a massive, diversionary charge on the outer walls, hoping to draw focus away from the main gate and allow Elara a chance to escape. The Silver Guard met the charge with brutal, overwhelming efficiency. It was a massacre. The walls erupted with boiling oil and a storm of arrows. Kael's forces, already depleted, were pinned down and decimated. In the midst of the chaos, a single, clear voice cut through the carnage from the central battlement of the keep. It was Lady Isolde. "Withdraw, pretender! Your sacrifice is meaningless!" Isolde's voice boomed, amplified by the high walls. "The infiltration was compromised from the start. Your source was my source!" Then, a moment that shattered Kael's world utterly. A figure was dragged onto the battlements next to Isolde. It was Elara. She was unharmed, but flanked by Silver Guard. Isolde raised her hand. "Behold, the only honest woman in your wretched rebel army. She did not betray you for fear or for silver, but for the promise of stability. She worked for Lord Valerius for 3 years, sending him the location of every secret meeting, every loyalist priest, and every plan of descent you ever discussed." Kael stood frozen, his sword dropping slightly, his mind refusing to process the impossible information. The love that was his only anchor was, in fact, the leash that had led him into a trap. Every detail of his life, his training, his location, Morland's fate, Thomas's counsel, had been filtered through the eyes of the usurper's agent. He looked up at Elara. She did not look triumphant, or even cruel. She looked utterly broken. Her eyes met his across the blood-soaked distance of the battlefield, and they held only a terrible, vast sorrow. The broken heart. Isolde, seeing Kael's paralysis, used the moment to deliver the final blow. "She gave us the location of the decree of the First Lords. Lord Valerius now holds the proof of your lineage. You have nothing, pretender! You are a fraud!" Kael felt the world tilt. The decree, the physical proof of his legitimacy, the thing he had hidden so carefully in the crypt wall, the thing he had shown only to Elara, was gone. The shock was a physical pain, a dagger twisting in his chest. His mother's death had taught him hate. Lira's betrayal taught him despair. It was not just a military loss. It was the ruin of his entire moral foundation. Valerius had not just seized his crown. He had stolen his capacity for trust. Isolde gave her final order. "This is what happens to loyalty. Kill the others. But bring Elara back to the capital for her reward." The Silver Guard began ruthlessly executing the captured infiltration team. Kael watched as Elara was led away, her last silent look at him a plea for understanding that he would not grant. The sheer weight of the lie, the years of shared secrets, stolen kisses, and profound, false trust, was crushing him. His men, demoralized by the betrayal and facing annihilation, began to flee. Anya, the Iron Fist warrior, grabbed Kael, whose body was numb with shock. "We must go! We are surrounded! Your war is not lost, but this day is!" she shouted, dragging him away from the walls. Kael allowed himself to be pulled back, leaving behind the bodies of his loyal men and the spectral image of the woman who had loved him enough to betray his kingdom for what she believed was true stability. He was severely wounded, not by the Silver Guard's blades, but by the shattering realization that the one thing he fought for, human connection, was the very thing that had brought him to the brink of ruin. Kael and the remnants of his army retreated from the siege of the Serpent's Gate in total rout. They were beaten, their supplies gone, their morale destroyed. He had lost the key battle, the woman he loved, and the decree that proved his right to exist. The usurper had won. And Kael, the broken, isolated prince, now faced his lowest point, a desperate escape into the unknown, wounded and utterly alone in a labyrinth of secrets. The route from Serpent's Gate was the lowest point of the entire campaign. Kael retreated not just physically, but emotionally. He was hunted, wounded, and shattered by the twin betrayals, Lyra's treason and the loss of the decree. He had lost everything his mother and Thomas had died to preserve. Anya and the Iron Fist survivors dragged Kael east, away from the familiar lands of Erthos, toward the ancient, desolate border with the neighboring kingdom of Viridia. They needed neutral ground to recover, and Kael needed to find a reason not to simply lie down and die. The scars of the lie. Physically, Kael healed quickly in the remote, abandoned monastery where Anya sequestered him. Emotionally, he was a wasteland. He suffered from fevered visions, nightmares where Lyra's sorrowful eyes and Isolde's cold sneer merged into a single, agonizing image of failure. He questioned everything. Every lesson from Thomas, every alliance forged through the Varus scroll, every move he had made. The betrayal had not only ruined his campaign, it had poisoned his memory of the past. If Lyra was Valerius's agent, then Thomas's advice, Morland's sacrifice, were they all just manipulated steps leading to this final, desperate ruin? Anya, the stone-hearted warrior, became his unwelcome confessor. She saw the sickness in his soul and refused to pity him. "You weep for the lie, southern thing," Anya stated, sitting beside him, sharpening her axe with a monotonous, chilling rhythm. "You are angry she was a traitor. You should be angry she was better than you. She was the best soldier Valerius had. You wasted your life being good. You needed to be deadly." Her brutal honesty was the only thing that managed to cut through his despair. She forced him back into training, but now the lessons were purely about self-preservation and cold logic. She stripped the romance and the heroism out of the war, leaving only the grim, unyielding duty of survival. The historian's final gift. As Kael began to regain his strength, he started to meticulously reread the last writings Thomas had given him, a small, coded journal that was Thomas's secret work, written in a cipher Kael had barely learned before the siege. He wasn't looking for strategy now. He was searching for truth, the genuine, unadulterated history of his father, King Gareth. Thomas's journal revealed a history far more complicated than the simple narrative of Gareth's mercy and Valerius's betrayal. It was a dense, painful account of King Gareth's final, desperate years. Gareth was not merely overthrown, he had been systematically dismantled by a secret, pervasive conspiracy, a labyrinth of secrets that ran deeper than Valerius. The journal outlined the truth of the Ash King name. It wasn't just a cruel nickname. It was because Gareth, heartbroken by the famine and chaos that Valerius's faction had stoked, was planning a radical, unprecedented act, a voluntary abdication and division of the kingdom, ceding power to regional councils to prevent civil war and save lives. Valerius, Thomas revealed, didn't seize the throne to save the kingdom. He seized it to prevent the division, because division would have broken the economic power of the noble coalition, the cabal of greedy lords and merchant guilds that truly controlled the realm. Valerius was not the true master. He was the iron hand of a far older, richer conspiracy. His lieutenants, Lysander, Malachi, and Vesper, were the public faces, but the true power lay with the handful of noble houses who were manipulating Valerius himself. Thomas's final, scribbled entry was the most damning. The betrayal of Gareth came not from the obvious enemy, but from the most trusted friend. The conspiracy is sewn into the very fabric of the royal council. The usurper is a puppet, the deeper traitor. This revelation refocused Kael's rage. He stopped obsessing over Lyra's personal betrayal and saw it for what it was, a tactic in a game played by unseen forces. He needed to find the true source of the power that manipulated Valerius. Kael used the remnants of his forces, Anya's iron fist and a few loyalists, to track down the last living member of King Gareth's royal council who had not immediately fled or joined Valerius, Lord Eldrin, a reclusive scholar known for his fierce neutrality. They found Eldrin hiding in a small, guarded hermitage in Viridia. Kael confronted him, his face cold, holding Thomas's journal. Eldrin, terrified and old, confessed everything. He confirmed the existence of the noble coalition and the truth of Valerius's role as their puppet. He revealed the true mastermind, the one who pulled the strings of the entire conspiracy, the house that controlled the kingdom's entire supply of grain and thus, its ultimate stability. The name was a shock that hit Kael harder than any blade. It was not Valerius. It was not Lysander. It was the House of Tremaine, a powerful, ostensibly neutral family that had played both sides and whose patriarch, Lord Tremaine, had been Gareth's most trusted childhood friend and the official protector of the Crown Prince. Tremaine had not betrayed Gareth through war, but through subtle, decades-long economic sabotage, engineering the famines and chaos that made Valerius's coup seem like a necessity. The greatest betrayal was cloaked in the robes of friendship and loyalty. This was the core of the labyrinth. The reforging of the king. The knowledge transformed Kael. He realized his entire war had been misdirected. He wasn't fighting a man, Valerius. He was fighting an economic and political system, the noble coalition, and its ultimate master, Lord Tremaine. He looked at the wreckage of his life, his mother, Morlun, Thomas, Lyra. He hadn't lost them to a brute, but to a smiling, calculating politician who had never drawn a sword. He emerged from the monastery a new man. He was no longer Kael, the vengeful prince, or Crow, the angry thief. He was the king of necessity. He now possessed the truth that could dismantle Valerius's reign from the inside out. The loss of the decree no longer mattered. Valerius held the scroll, the proof of Kael's birthright. But Kael now held the truth, the proof of Valerius's puppethood. The truth was the finer, deadlier weapon. The labyrinth of secrets had been navigated. Kael was finally ready to stop mourning the lost love and lost legitimacy and start fighting the real war, a war of information, strategy, and coalition building against the true, hidden power of Erthos. Kael's recovery was complete. The wounded prince who fled Serpent's Gate was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating strategist driven by the twin truths of Morland's sacrifice and Thomas's final journal. He was no longer motivated by vengeance against Valerius, but by the need to dismantle the invisible power structure of the noble coalition, the system that truly controlled Erthos. His new war was not fought with swords, but with information. The power of the truth. Kael and the remnants of his loyalists, the grim, effective Anya and her iron fist, and a small, trusted network of Lyra's former smugglers, now led by the sharp-witted Michael, began their campaign of political disruption. They leveraged the Varus scroll not to recruit allies, but to expose vulnerabilities. Kael's target was the remaining, powerful noble houses who still officially pledged fealty to Valerius, but were secretly chafing under the usurper's financial yoke. He knew the nobles cared not for the Ash King's lineage, but for their own survival. Kael used the information from Thomas's journal and Lord Eldrin's confession to craft a terrifying, targeted message. The House of Tremaine was the true power, and Valerius was merely their strongman, enforcing a system designed to concentrate all wealth and ruin the lesser nobility. He didn't preach freedom, he preached economic ruin. The messages were delivered with devastating precision, anonymous, coded letters sent to the great halls of the land, detailing how Tremaine's monopolies on grain, salt, and iron were slowly bankrupting the houses that had previously funded the kingdom. The effect was profound. Valerius's power was built on the myth of his absolute strength and stability. The revelation that he was simply a puppet of the merchant class, a second-hand tyrant, shattered the carefully constructed facade of his divine mandate. The assembly of swords. The discontent matured into open revolt. The great houses of Hearth and Stark, powerful, land-rich families who had been passive for years, publicly broke their fealty. They had not been converted to Kael's cause. They had been mobilized by fear of the Tremaine coalition. Kael met the assembled lords in a secret covenant carved deep into the ruins of an ancient fortress. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion. The nobles looked at Kael, the young, battle-hardened man with the scars of the street and the mountain, with deep skepticism. Lord Stark, a man whose family history stretched back 1,000 years, spoke first, his voice heavy with contempt. "You ask us to risk our centuries of lineage on a single, failed scroll and a boy who has been beaten back to the border. Why should we not deliver you to Valerius and bargain for better tax rates?" Kael did not appeal to their loyalty or their conscience. He appealed to their greed and their pride. You will not deliver me to Valerius because your fate is already sealed by the house of Tremaine, Kael retorted, his voice calm, holding the room in an iron grip. I am not asking you to fight for a lost crown. I am asking you to fight for your inheritance. If Valerius falls, I guarantee your ancestral lands and titles remain yours, free of Tremaine's taxes and monopolies. If Valerius wins, Tremaine will devour you slowly until your name is worth less than the dust on your boots. He then showed them undeniable, meticulously documented proof, courtesy of Thomas's journal and Lyra's past intelligence, of Tremaine's secret financial agreements with Valerius. The evidence was too damning to ignore. Kael had given them a common enemy greater than himself, and a tangible reward. The cynical logic of the nobility was satisfied. The coalition was formed, not a union of hearts, but an assembly of swords driven by self-interest. The cost of forgiveness. As Kael's coalition swelled with men and resources, he faced a necessary and deeply personal dilemma. The nobles demanded a general, a commander who could match Lady Isolde's brilliance. Kael was a proven warrior, but he lacked the grand strategic experience the lords trusted. The solution came from the one place Kael dreaded, the capital. A coded message arrived from Michael's network, detailing the fate of Lyra. Valerius, blinded by his own arrogance and Isolde's tactical brilliance, had kept Lyra close, intending to use her as a propaganda tool. But Lyra, trapped within the usurper's inner court, had discovered the extent of the Tremaine coalition's power, a power far greater and more terrifying than she had even helped them build. She sent a single message through the tunnels: Valerius is a shield. The wolf is his spear. The man behind the mask is Tremaine. I can break them all, but only if I am the one to lead the charge. Kael was faced with the ultimate betrayal, now offering the ultimate weapon. Lyra was the architect of his greatest defeat, but her understanding of Valerius's court and her sheer, ruthless strategic genius, proven at Serpent's Gate, was exactly what his burgeoning army lacked. She was the one commander who could match Isolde. Kael met with his new lords, laying out the difficult choice. Lord Hearth recoiled. The traitor? The woman who sold your father's scroll? Are you mad? She will slit your throat in your sleep. She will, Kael agreed, his voice cold and emotionless. If I allow it. But Lyra did not betray me for Valerius. She betrayed me because she believed Valerius offered stability to a kingdom she saw as falling apart. When she found the truth, that Valerius's stability was a lie for Tremaine's profit, she turned. Her survival instinct is her weakness, and now, it is our greatest strength. Kael made the hardest choice of his life. He risked his kingdom and his soul on the logic of necessity. He sent the retrieval order. He would bring Lyra back from the jaws of the usurper, not as his lover, but as his general. He had learned Thomas's final lesson completely. A king cannot afford the luxury of personal hatred or personal love. He must use every weapon at his disposal, even the one that nearly destroyed him. The coalition was forged, strong in its shared goal of political survival, and now led by a heart hardened by an ultimate, calculated risk. The march to the capital was about to begin. The assembly of swords, a sprawling, uneasy coalition of mountain axes, noble cavalry, and common infantry, began its march toward the capital. This was not the stealth of the crow, but the undeniable roar of open war. The objective was clear: shatter Valerius's authority by seizing his primary seat of power, the city he had built on his lies. Kael rode at the head of the army, but the true master of the march was Elara, his newly appointed general. Her return was the single greatest risk, and the greatest weapon, of the entire campaign. The general and the king. Elara was an enigma to the nobles and a cold, terrifying marvel to Kael. She wore no armor, only simple, dark leather, and her authority was absolute. She never spoke of her time in Valerius's court, her part in the betrayal, or her reasons for returning. She spoke only in tactics, supply lines, troop rotations, and intelligence reports. She was a commander of devastating foresight. She countered every ambush Valerius's remaining loyalists set, often anticipating the usurper's moves days in advance, thanks to her intimate knowledge of the enemy's logistical patterns, knowledge gained from her years as an agent. Kael and Elara maintained a rigorous, icy professionalism. They met only in the command tent, speaking only of war. The deep, messy river of their past love was completely dammed, replaced by the sterile, necessary flow of strategy. One night, studying maps by candlelight, Kael finally broke the silence. "The siege of Serpent's Gate," Kael said, not as an accusation, but as a clinical observation. "You sold us out to Isolde. Was it always the plan to be the ultimate double agent, or did you genuinely believe Valerius was the safer bet?" Elara didn't look up from the maps. Her voice was flat, devoid of the emotion he remembered. "I don't deal in belief, Kael. I deal in certainty. Your father's rule was chaos. Valerius's rule was order, however cruel. I believed order, however costly, was preferable to anarchy. When I learned Valerius's order was just a smokescreen for Tremaine's economic ruin, a tyranny of coin, not conviction, I knew I had chosen the wrong side. I don't fight for your crown, Kael. I fight for the chance to make certain that Tremaine never bankrupts this kingdom again." Her confession was the closest thing to an apology he would ever receive. It solidified his choice. Elara was not driven by love or hate, but by a relentless desire for a stable future, a future she was willing to commit the ultimate betrayal to secure. The weight of the vows. As the army drew closer to the capital, the weight of the campaign pressed on Kael. He had lost his mother, love, Morlan, loyalty, and Thomas' guidance. He had traded the beautiful simplicity of their sacrifice for the ugly, complicated compromises of the noble coalition. He often spoke privately with Anya, the only one of his true loyalists who still tolerated the cold presence of Elara. "The nobles hate me, Anya. They hate Elara more. They only follow us because they hate Tremaine's taxes more than they hate the Ash King's son," Kael confessed, watching the noble contingents with suspicion. Anya, ever the pragmatist, merely grunted. "They are horses, Kael. They hate the weight of the plow, but they will pull if the stable is warm and the feed is rich. Elara is the whip that drives them. You are the promise that awaits them. You are fighting for Erthos. They are fighting for gold. Both reasons are enough to kill the usurper. Her counsel, distilled and pure, always brought him back to the core mission. The kingdom was broken, and it would not be fixed by sentiment. It would be fixed by a king ruthless enough to understand that compromise is the coin of power. The final goodbyes. The army arrived at the outskirts of the capital city, settling into a massive staging camp on the very plains where Kael, as a child, had once dreamed of a life he would never have. The city, magnificent and oppressive, loomed in the distance, the prize. On the eve of the final assault, the atmosphere was thick with tension and silent farewells. The men knew this was the final throw of the dice. Kael walked the camp, seeing the faces of the commoners who had marched for him, fathers who were fighting for the first time, trusting a prince's name to restore their dignity. He saw the grim, stoic faces of the Iron Fist, ready to meet their end far from their mountains. He saw the cold calculation in the eyes of the nobles, ready to switch sides in the event of failure. He made one last, solitary pilgrimage to the place where he had hidden the decree, the crypt wall. Elara had betrayed its location, and Valerius now held it. He found the mortar chipped away and the hiding place empty, but pressed into the soft earth, a small, new object lay waiting, Elara's tarnished silver locket. The empty one he had given her before the Serpent's Gate. A wave of confusion and pain washed over him. Why had she left it here? Was it a final message? A final act of penance? He picked up the cold, fragile piece of metal. It was a reminder not of their love, which was dead, but of his humanity, which he was desperately trying to keep alive. The locket was broken, like his heart, and like the kingdom he was about to reclaim. He would wear it into battle, not as a charm, but as a chain linking him to the cost of his choices. The eve of the last stand. Kael and Elara stood together, looking toward the dark, looming silhouette of the capital, planning the final, massive assault. Valerius knows we are here. He expects a siege, Elara said, her voice steady. We will not give him one. We will use the tunnels from the old city, the ones I helped design to funnel troops. We will strike the main gate from within, and we will do it at dawn, when morale is lowest. And Isolde? Kael asked, his eyes hard. He knew the wolf would be waiting. Isolde will try to predict us. She will see the logic of the tunnels and reinforce them. That is why Anya and the Iron Fist will attack the tunnels, but only as a decoy. The main assault, Kael, must be at the Imperial Gate, the one she is certain we will ignore. It was a final, stunning piece of tactical genius. It used every piece of knowledge Elara possessed, including the psychological profile of her greatest rival. If she anticipates my anticipation, we win, Kael murmured, finally allowing a hint of respect to bleed through the coldness. You win, Elara corrected, looking at him for the first time with a gaze that held a flicker of the old warmth, quickly extinguished by the discipline of command. But victory is not the end, Kael. It is only the beginning of the burden. The dawn was approaching. Kael stood ready, clad in the simple, dark armor of the mountain clans, not the polished steel of a noble. He was king, warrior, and broken man, all in one. He carried the weight of every sacrifice, every betrayal, and every life that was about to be lost. The time for planning was over. It was time for the final, bloody kingmaker's last stand. The assault began not with a shout, but with a terrifying silence just before dawn. The capital, choked by Valerius's fear, had endured the winter of doubt, but it was about to face the spring of blood. Lyra's plan was a masterful piece of deception built on Isolde's known genius. Anya and the Iron Fist launched a furious, noisy attack on the ancient, supposedly secret cistern tunnels, the expected point of infiltration. Isolde, predictable in her perfection, had indeed reinforced those tunnels, committing a significant portion of the Silver Guard to the underground defense. The Iron Fist, knowing their role, fought savagely, giving their lives not to penetrate the city, but to fix the wolf's gaze. Meanwhile, Kael and the main body of the Assembly of Swords, the noble cavalry, the peasants, and the loyal foot soldiers, struck the Imperial Gate, the massive, imposing entrance Isolde had deemed too obvious to warrant heavy reinforcement. The breach. The fighting at the Imperial Gate was brutal, a desperate, concentrated effort against steel and wood. The Silver Guard fought with the cold discipline Valerius had instilled, but Kael's men fought with the desperate hope of men who had everything to lose. Kael was the heart of the assault. He wielded his mountain axe with the speed of his youth, and the killing intent of his purpose. He moved through the chaos, driven by the memory of Thomas's final words and the weight of Lyra's locket, a silent symbol of his final, agonizing compromise. The battle raged for 3 hours. Kael's army hammered the gate, while Lyra, acting as field commander, masterfully rotated the raw peasant infantry with the professional noble cavalry, preventing their line from breaking. Finally, the gate splintered. Kael and the Iron Fist survivors were the first to surge through, meeting the remaining Silver Guard in a swirling, visceral melee in the courtyard. The city was breached. The battle had become a street fight. The duel of generals. The fighting was relentless as Kael's forces pushed through the outer wards toward the Great Hall. But Isolde, realizing her deception, had reacted with terrifying speed. She pulled her forces from the tunnels and converged on Kael's position. Lyra met her. The two brilliant women, united by their tactical genius but separated by their moral conviction, faced off in the smoke-choked Central Avenue. Isolde sat atop her warhorse, her polished black armor gleaming, a perfect, deadly vision of control. Lyra stood on the cobblestones, directing the flow of battle with an uncanny calm. "You should have stayed with Valerius, Lyra," Isolde's voice cut through the noise. "You had stability, rank, and safety. You traded it for chaos and a dead man's line." "I traded a tyranny of fear for a chance at justice, Isolde." Lyra shot back, never breaking eye contact. "You fight for the preservation of power. I fight for the dismantling of Tremaine's economic chokehold." Isolde, realizing Lyra possessed the knowledge of the true conspiracy, lost her composure for the first time. The wolf's mask slipped, revealing only fury. Isolde ordered a reckless cavalry charge directly at Elara. Elara did not run. She waited until the last possible second, then gave a sharp, precise signal. A volley of iron fist arrows, reserved solely for this moment, erupted from the rooftops, crippling the front line of Isolde's charge. The attack broke. Isolde, thrown from her horse, found herself surrounded. She fought with the terrifying skill of a cornered animal, but Elara had trapped her perfectly. It was over. Elara walked toward the defeated general, her face grim. The wolf is tamed, Isolde. The battle is lost. The iron heart of the usurper. While Elara secured the outer city and captured the generals, Kael fought his way into the Great Hall, the seat of Valerius's power. The immense hall, usually silent and cold, was a scene of desperation. Valerius, dressed in simple black mail, stood defiant on the steps of the throne. Beside him stood High Steward Malachi and Cardinal Vesper, the architects of his tyranny. "You have come for your vengeance, whelp," Valerius stated, his voice ringing with a cold, almost noble arrogance. "You have lost your mother, your mentor, and your lover for a throne you are too weak to hold." Kael ignored the insults, his gaze fixed on the man. "I have come not for vengeance, Valerius. I have come for justice. You were a strong man, but you were a puppet of Tremaine. You ruled with iron, but they pulled your strings with gold." The revelation struck Valerius like a blow. The usurper, who believed in his own necessity, finally saw the true depths of his own manipulation. His composure wavered. "Lies! I saved this kingdom!" Valerius roared, drawing a heavy ceremonial sword. Kael stepped forward. "You will answer for the death of my family. You will answer for the misery of my people. But the true reckoning is for the men who used your noble ambition to build their greedy empire." Kael rushed the throne, bypassing the useless Vesper and the cowardly Malachi. The duel was swift, brutal, and utterly without fanfare. Valerius fought with the desperate strength of a man who still believes he is right, but Kael fought with the cold, controlled fury of a man who knows he is necessary. The fighting lasted mere minutes. Kael's axe found its mark, shattering Valerius's guard and sinking into his side. Valerius collapsed onto the cold marble steps, his blood staining the pale stone of the hall. As Kael stood over him, Valerius looked up, his eyes meeting Kael's. "You will be a better king than your father Kael," Valerius whispered, a final, chilling assessment. "Because you are now the monster he refused to be." Kael did not reply. He drove the axe home, ending the reign of the usurper. The final scars. The city fell swiftly after Valerius's death. The Silver Guard surrendered en masse, and the nobles of the coalition rushed to publicly proclaim their fealty to the new king. But the victory was immediately soured. Lord Tremaine, the true mastermind, had fled the capital just hours before the assault, disappearing into his western estates with his entire fortune. The core of the conspiracy, the economic engine, remained intact. Kael walked through the now silent Great Hall. He ordered the immediate execution of Lysander, Malachi, and Vesper. He walked past Elara, who was organizing the transition of power, her face an unreadable mask of exhaustion and calculation. She paused only once. The people are cheering, Kael. The usurper is dead. The war is won. The war to take the throne is won, Elara, Kael replied, looking at the fresh blood on the marble. The war to keep the kingdom is only just beginning. Tremaine is still out there. We killed the shield and the spear, but the rot remains. He walked up the bloody steps and sat heavily upon the stone throne, cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving. He was King Kael, the son of the Ash King. He had paid the ultimate price in sacrifice and betrayal. He had won the war, but he had lost his peace. The last stand was over, and the crushing weight of the crown settled upon his head. The coronation of Kael, the Restorer, was a somber, muted affair, less a celebration and more a statement of weary intent. He was crowned with a simple, iron circlet, having refused the ancient gold crown, saying it was too heavy with his father's sorrow. The kingdom had been won, but the victory was a fragile thing, built on a shaky coalition of cynical nobles and a war-weary populace. The true power, the House of Tremaine, remained a threat, having retreated to consolidate their wealth and sow future discord. Kael's reign began not with grand decrees of mercy, but with swift, brutal reforms. He did not repeat his father's weakness. He abolished the most onerous taxes, fulfilling his promise to the people, but he used the iron fist to crush any lingering noble resistance with terrifying efficiency. He was a king of mercy with an iron hand. He ruled from the same cold, massive great hall, but he never sat idly on the throne. He moved constantly, tirelessly. He did not trust the nobles. He did not trust the people. He did not even trust the silent, masterful General Elara, who remained his closest, most invaluable, and most terrifying advisor. Elara was granted no titles and asked for no public recognition. She served Kael with a devotion that seemed rooted not in love, but in a shared, cold belief in the necessity of his reign. They were two broken halves of a brutal purpose, bound together by the secret knowledge of the war's true cost and the ultimate enemy. They would never again be lovers. They were simply king and kingmaker. Kael often stood alone on the battlements at night, gazing out over the capital. The sounds of the city were different now, not the silence of fear, but the hesitant, hopeful noise of rebuilding. He had brought them peace, purchased at the price of his own soul. He knew he would never have the quiet life Elara once dreamed of. The true war was not against the usurper, but against the internal rot of the kingdom, the greed that had killed his father. He reached up, touching the empty silver locket he still wore beneath his armor, a symbol of the love he sacrificed for the crown he now bore. He was a king, but he was also a scar, a monument to the price of justice. The story of Kael, the Restorer, had ended the age of tyranny and begun the age of resilience. But the whispers of Erthos still held a warning. The crown was not a reward. It was a burden. And the true king was the one who was ready to carry that weight, alone, forever.